Vamos a empezar de una vez con el eje de familia, educación y transformación de conflictos. No vamos a tener exactamente una videoconferencia. La doctora Sheila McNamee, fue sugerencia inicialmente de ella de hacer la presentación no en videoconferencia directa para ayudar a lo que tiene que ver con el proceso de traducción. Entonces ella nos hizo llegar la semana pasada su video de la conferencia, ya lo grabó en su computador, nos lo envió. La Universidad de Caldas nos ayudó en televisión, tuvimos dos ayudas muy importantes. Por un lado, la traducción del video. El profesor César Augusto Montes de la Universidad de Manizales nos apoyó enormemente con traducir los textos del video de la doctora Sheila. La Universidad de Caldas, su oficina de televisión, hizo todo el ejercicio de poner la subtitulación de los textos en español. Ustedes van a ver el video, van a ver a la doctora Sheila y van a escucharla, pero además podrán ir leyendo la traducción de los planteamientos que ella va haciendo en su video. Al final de la presentación, el video dura alrededor de 40 minutos. Al final de la presentación, la doctora Sheila McNamee va a estar conectada por Skype, podremos verla y escucharla, y va a estar atenta a responder las preguntas que ustedes tengan frente a los planteamientos que ella va a hacer en la mañana de hoy. El profesor César Augusto Montes Loaiza de la Universidad de Manizales estará aquí con nosotros acompañándonos para hacer la traducción de las preguntas que ustedes tienen para ella y de las respuestas que la doctora Sheila nos comparta frente a los interrogantes que le hagamos. Esa va a ser como la dinámica de esta primera parte de la mañana. Antes de empezar, les recuerdo quién es la doctora Sheila McNamee. La doctora Sheila McNamee es magíster y doctora en comunicación de la Universidad de Massachusetts en Estados Unidos, es profesora de la Facultad de Comunicación de la Universidad de New Hampshire, también en Estados Unidos, y es vicepresidenta del Instituto Taos. Es profesora visitante de la Universidad de Tilburg en Holanda y del doctorado de la Universidad de Tilburg. La profesora Sheila McNamee hace parte de los teóricos que en la actualidad están aportando a toda la reflexión y propuesta conceptual que el construccionismo social está haciendo, y nos va a acompañar en la mañana de hoy con su conferencia, como se las mencioné hace un momento, la transformación del conflicto, de lo ético, disculpen mi acelere, entonces voy a confundir el título de la conferencia. La transformación del conflicto, de lo correcto e incorrecto a una ética relacional. Entonces vamos a ver el video de la doctora Sheila. Adelante.
Hello, and I'm sorry that I can't be physically present with you all, but I'm just really delighted that I have this opportunity to be with you virtually, and I will be sort of present with you in a little bit over the internet, but still will be in the same time and place. What I want to talk about is conflict transformation. And I really want to introduce an idea about dialogue as a way to move beyond conflict and also beyond consensus, and connect this with this notion that I refer to as a relational ethic. Now, the implications for dialogue, transformation, and relational ethics in terms of how we think about families and communities and education should be apparent. So if you'll bear with me, I'd like to take more of a higher level view of just talking about a way of orienting ourselves or positioning ourselves in terms of conflict, and then talk about some specific forms of practice that can help us do that. And I believe and I hope that the connection and the relationship to families and to education will be apparent. And then perhaps in the give and take that we have in conversation in a little bit, we can address those connections more specifically. So Let me introduce the idea of dialogue, which I think is very important. Dialogue is not any form of communication. It's not conversation. Dialogue, for me, is a very special kind of interaction. It doesn't happen very often, and it doesn't usually happen spontaneously. It certainly can, but oftentimes we have to create opportunities to engage in genuine dialogue. So what do I mean by dialogue? To me, I draw on Mikhail Bakhtin's notion of dialogue, where he talks about dialogue as a responsive activity. Responsive dialogue, being responsive, situates us as practitioners within what I consider a relational ethic, where we're being attentive to the process of relating itself. So, in other words, instead of focusing on individuals, instead of focusing on certain forms of action, certain behaviors, certain objects or entities or contexts, we're really looking at what are we doing together? What is what we're doing together creating? What sorts of possibilities are emerging? So it's attentive to this. If we take this approach of towards dialogue, we recognize that there are always multiple ways of looking at a situation. It's one of the aspects of dialogue that I think is most important, that there isn't, just because we are professionals and we are trained in a particular way, that doesn't mean that that's the only way to look at a situation. I think it's particularly relevant when we think about the families that we work with, when we think about what we're doing in educational contexts, what we're doing when we confront conflict and difference within communities. It's really important for us to hold on to this idea that there are multiple realities that are constructed. And how can we be responsive to that multiplicity and at the same time not judge them, okay? So we don't want to be too quick to enter into a conflict situation with the notion that we're going to sort out what's right and what's wrong, who should be punished and who should be rewarded. But rather we want to enter into these different contexts, trying to understand the variety of ways in which different people make sense of different situations. So one of the things that dialogue does is foster a sense of curiosity. And the question for us as practitioners and professionals is, how do we foster curiosity about differences, particularly when what we see is something that we're not particularly fond of? So we might see a form of action, a way of being, something happening in a family, in a community, in an educational context that we think is wrong. How do we enter into interaction with those people engaged and involved in this situation in such a way that we are not automatically judging, okay? So that's the position of dialogue. Let me just pause for a minute. Of course, I'm going to return to this because this is the basis of what I want to be talking about this morning. But let me contrast it for a moment from its opposite, which we refer to as monologism. We could also refer to monologism as individualism or modernism. They all pretty much mean the same thing. Edward Sampson is a social psychologist who writes a lot about the distinction between dialogue and monologue. And he says monologue, when we step into that monologic space, we are really self-centered. We are focusing on ourselves, our own opinions, our own beliefs, and others are only useful to us as they help us realize and construct and reconstruct the kind of person we want to be. So another way of thinking about this is we're moving, what I'm proposing we move away from is a notion of a self-contained individual where we look at everybody as having their own thoughts, beliefs, values, traits, personality, intelligence, everything that makes a person what he or she is contained within the person, within the boundary of the skin, the self-contained individual, okay? That's the predominant modernist view. And if we accept that view, then that is what we focus on when we're looking at conflict, when we're looking at any form of interaction or social process. We want to then study each individual, find out who that person is, how that person thinks, what's good or bad, right or wrong about that person, and then make recommendations, engage and develop remedial programs, training programs to make things better. Okay, so this monologic view has us really focusing on the self-contained individual. When we step into dialogism, as I'm proposing, and as a constructionist and postmodernist perspective would suggest, we're no longer looking at self-contained individuals, but again, to repeat what I said earlier, we're looking at processes of interaction. We're looking at what people are doing and who they become as they engage in interaction. So, if you will, there's no longer this attentiveness to this individual here and this individual here and how they get into conflict, but there's more a look at the in-between the two individuals to examine how are their actions responsive to each other. How are they together in the very interactive moment? How are they creating certain possibilities for meaning and closing down other possibilities for meaning? So this relational focus is a dialogic focus that looks at processes of interaction. Okay. One way of describing this, which helps us to understand that we're looking at processes of interaction and also helps us to understand how it is that there are multiple worldviews, multiple beliefs, multiple truths circulating, is to understand that when we interact with one another, one of the interesting things about being human is that we coordinate with others and with our environment very easily, okay? I'm not talking about coordination as being a good or a bad thing, it's positive or negative. I'm talking about it as a simple process of interaction, that we kind of act, there's a response, we move in the world in some kind of coordinated fashion. And those coordinations develop into patterns over time, so that you might have a certain way of talking with a family member, with a colleague, that is typical of your relationship. So very quickly, from the way we coordinate and interact with others, we create patterns. And those patterns then come to take on a sense of expectations of, you know, what's expected of us, what's expected of the other person we're interacting with or people. And from those sets of expectations, we create with others a whole sense of what is real, what is true, what is good, what is bad, what we would call a worldview, what we might call a reality, what I also frequently like to call a moral order, okay? This is my moral order, this is what's good. So every time we coordinate or interact with other people, we are creating with them whole worldviews. Now, if we stop and think about how many interactions, real and imagined and virtual like this one, that we have in a given day, we have to recognize that we ourselves we hold multiple worldviews, multiple realities, multiple moral orders, a lot of them overlapping, a lot of them completely distinct. So we are not unified, whole, consistent beings, but rather we are multi-beings. We have multiple truths that we hold on to and move through the world with. So if that's the case, if everything we are doing in the world with other people is the possibility for constructing a new way of seeing the world, then why should we expect people to agree automatically? Why should we expect conformity? In fact, from this point of view, this dialogic point of view, it is much more logical to anticipate and expect difference, diversity, the multiplicity of perspectives, and therefore conflict. because when perspectives don't match, we often have conflict. So let me say a couple of other things about this notion of the multiplicity of worldviews. First, I want to say that within any community, within any family, within any relationship, there is a reality, there is truth, okay? But both that reality and that truth are small r, small t, reality and truth, not universal. So that reality, realities, are always local. They're always situated. It's not to say that they don't exist. It's to recognize that they exist in context always. So it's important that we hold on to that notion. And it's also, the second thing I want to point out is how important it is for us to understand that a reality or a truth or a belief held by another group of people, another community, by another family, while we may think it's wrong or bad, we have to stop and become curious, as I mentioned earlier, about how that truth or reality is actually coherent and consistent and completely logical and rational for the members of the community who have constructed that belief, that way of being, that truth. So this brings us again to the idea of dialogue, where what dialogue is it's a practice that holds in tension, I mean tense, one worldview and another worldview. And instead of trying to figure out which one is right and which one is wrong, or try to find some way to make them be the same, what we try to do with dialogue is let the differences coexist and become curious so that we can start some kind of conversation or interaction that allows us to coordinate and therefore construct new understandings. So if you go back to the first principle that I mentioned, that we are always interacting and coordinating, and through those coordinated actions, we're creating new worlds. How do we take two very different and opposing worldviews and find ways to begin a conversation so that there's a coordination happening there, which then, of course, has the possibility of creating a new sense of understanding or a new worldview. So that's the basic premise. And it's simple and it's complex. The complexity of it is moving out of this idea that we are self-contained individuals and stepping into this space of constantly asking ourselves the question, what are we creating here? What meaning, what truth, what standards are we using to judge, to evaluate? And could the people, the family, the community that I'm working with be perhaps using other standards that are perfectly coherent for them? All right. Now, one of the pieces that's important for us to hold on to here also is this idea of judging or holding judgment, but at the same time, not condoning anything. So, in other words, I'm not suggesting that any perspective, any way of acting is okay. What I'm suggesting is that when we enter into a conflict situation or a situation of difference, with the idea that we need to correct the other's differences or bad behaviors, we're doing a form of violence because we're imposing our worldview on someone else's worldview. And what we should be doing instead is trying to start a conversation. So a third option, a third worldview that includes both of us can be constructed. But that doesn't mean that we agree with or condone the actions that we think are evil or bad. So it's a position of suspending our judgment, suspending our way of evaluating another group, another family, another community's beliefs, and waiting to see what we can construct together. So it is not the case that anything goes. It's not the case that as long as you have a community or a family where you construct your beliefs, that's okay. We do need to live together. And I think that the idea of a relational ethic is to try to find a way to bring these incommensurate, diametrically opposing ways of living in the world together to find something that allows us all to go on together. So how can we do this? How can we create this sort of dialogic space where we can hold the tension of difference? And as John Stewart, a communication theorist, says, we want to hold our own ground. We want to recognize and acknowledge our own beliefs and position, but we also want to allow the other the space to do the same. So how do we enter into conversation that's not persuasive or corrective or judgmental or debate in the debate or argumentative format? How do we do that? So there are some resources that I'd like to introduce, and these are not techniques. I don't think that there's a technique for conflict resolution. I don't think there's a correct technique for education. I don't think there's a correct technique for transforming family life and making it more compatible in a community. I think that what we have instead are resources for action. And these are resources that we can make real in very different ways depending on how we use them and where we are and who we're engaging with. So I think one of the things we first need to do is create the context for dialogue. We can't expect to bring conflicting groups or conflicting people together and have them automatically engage in dialogue. I think that preparing people to come in together to have a different kind of conversation is about 99% of the work that we need to do. We need to explore how can we invite people to think in different ways. So sometimes that means changing the context, as simple as not having a meeting with conflicting parties in an institutional setting, but having it in a more comfortable setting. Another thing we can do to prepare people is talk with them ahead of time and ask them to think about what they would like to have come out of the conversation and how they might bring various resources they have to help make that happen. And ask people to think about what voices they would need to leave at home in order to avoid getting into the same conflict. So there are a number of things we can do, and there are certainly many others, but I think it's enough for right now to simply mention how important creating the context to have a different kind of conversation than the kind of conversation we typically have is. Okay, another resource that I'd like to highlight is what I call engaging in reflexive critique. So here, I think oftentimes we're very quick, particularly as professionals, to analyze a situation and to figure out what is the best way to intervene, what is the best way to act, what is the best thing to be done here. When I talk about reflexive critique, I mean training ourselves to engage in an inner dialogue first, where we question our certainty. So we might engage in a dialogue with ourselves that goes something like, am I so sure that this would be a good thing to do in this moment? Might there be some other way to engage this family, this community, in a more generative conversation? What other resources do I have available? So, in a sense, reflexive critique and dialogue, which is a use of reflexive critique, really asks us to kind of slow down the conversation so that we can think of alternatives rather than simply engaging in our typical professional practice with certainty that we know what needs to be done. One way of doing this that I think is a useful illustration is to point to the work of Jaakko Seikola in Finland. He has designed a method that he calls open dialogue. And when there's a problem, he's a psychiatrist, so he works with people with psychiatric problems, but open dialogue is a resource that we all can use in any context. When there is a crisis, when there is a conflict, rather than call in the expert and deal with the person in crisis or in conflict, or the people, what Seikola and his group do is create a space they call open dialogue, where the first thing they do is they ask, who are the people who should be part of this? Who should be here in this moment? That could be neighbors, community members, employers, employees, colleagues. It could be health professionals. It could be school officials. It could be anybody. It could be a large group, and often they are quite large. And rather than have the professional then analyze and kind of do a diagnosis of what's going wrong, everybody offers their perspective, their story of what's happening. This isn't a diagnosis, it's simply this is what I observe, okay? There are ground rules, of course, set so that people are saying things that they think would be useful. And then together, and the people in crisis, the people in conflict are part of this conversation, also offering their views. And together, the entire group develops a plan to try to deal with the conflict or the crisis. I think this form of open dialogue creates community. It creates a way where people help each other. So in Seikola's work, working with psychotic people, if someone is in a psychotic crisis, a neighbor who might be present in this open dialogue might offer their recognition that the person in crisis is left home alone quite often. And so part of a plan for moving forward might be that this person, this neighbor, will bring a meal once a day so that the person in crisis isn't alone so much. So this kind of, everyone is invited to reflect and think about the additional resources that they might have that could be brought to bear on the problem. So this kind of reflective critique is really quite useful. That's a self-reflexive critique. What can I do? What other things might be possible here? In addition, there's a way of being relationally reflexive, and that is to ask the people with whom we are working very clearly, is this conversation helpful? What are some things we could be talking about that could make this conversation more helpful, more useful to you, more generative? What should we be talking about that we have not talked about yet? What could we be doing that we're not doing yet? So to invite those with whom we work into a conversation that creates the opportunity for dialogue, the opportunity for us together to create new meaning rather than being evaluative and judgmental and corrective. Another resource I think that is useful is to give voice to the stories people bring. Now, oftentimes, particularly in conflict situations, we bring our positions, our values, that this is good and that is bad. This person did something that was awful and they need to change. But when we invite people, instead of speaking from, those are very abstract values that people are referring to in those cases. When we invite people instead to speak from their stories, why are you interested? What brought you to your concern about this issue? We populate the conflict with the local coherence that I was talking about before. So for example, in this case, I'm thinking of the work of the Public Conversation Project in Massachusetts in the US here, where they bring